President Cyril Ramaphosa says the African continent is facing the worsening effects of climate change. He has called for more bold action in global mitigation and adaptation. The president was addressing COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh.
It's a gathering of world leaders taking stock of decisions taken in Scotland, Glasgow last year. But the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine has affected the global economy, and countries are not able to deliver on promises they made. Some developed countries are currently reviewing the targets and timeframes on combating climate change.
We can no longer afford any further delays in mitigating the effect of climate change. African countries are losing between 3 to 5% of their GDP due to the effects of climate change. There is consensus from across the board that just transitions must be just, and they must also be inclusive, which is particularly important for developing economic countries, which are the worst affected by climate change.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on developed countries to stick to their promises. The developed North has promised to help the developing South to implement the just energy transition.
For transitions to be just, vulnerable workers and vulnerable communities need to be included in designing just solutions. The South African Cabinet recently endorsed our National Just Energy Transition Investment Plan as a basis for our pathway towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient society. And according to the plan, South Africa will need approximately $98 billion to correct an error that I made, not 98 trillion, but $98 billion over the next 5 years to enable a just transition and achieve the ambitious targets we set out in our nationally determined contribution.
The developing nations have slammed wealthy countries and oil companies for driving global warming.
Rwanda, like the rest of Africa, is ready to prioritize renewable energy. We do this for our own future. The point is not to generate carbon credits so that others can continue using coal, even as Africa is discouraged from exploiting its fossil fuel resources. The most valuable contribution that the developed countries can make is to reduce their emissions faster while investing with Africa to build sustainable green power.
Alors nous devons bien nous entendre. Nous sommes pour le climat.
Let's be clear. We are for the climate. We are in favor of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But for Africa, we cannot accept that our vital interests are undermined on the matter of energy transition.
Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged world leaders to work together to ensure that the world does not warm up more than 1.5 degrees and warned that the planet is on a highway to climate hell without an urgent action. Kylie Kumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Let's stay with this issue and speak to Stellenbosch University School for Climate Studies Acting Director, Professor Guy Midgley. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time this evening. I mean, South Africa, through President Cyril Ramaphosa, talking tough and pushing for wealthy nations to fulfill their obligations of supporting poorer countries with climate finance. But looking at what we've seen in the past, how hopeful are you that this is going to happen as speedily as others are calling for it to?
A little bit more hopeful than I have been the past few years. I think there's a real momentum building and very strongly around the world. There's a lot of concern about very significant adverse impacts occurring around the world. I mean, we've been experiencing these in developing countries for more than a decade. But now the rich countries are also being hit by very significant adverse effects. That's always a strong incentive. And this is an incredible incentive for this country, for our country, to transition to a kind of an economy which is much more inclusive, much more equitable, cleaner, more healthy, and which provides the young generations with a lot of hope for a very sustainable future over decades to come. So this is a very, very exciting opportunity. It's once in a lifetime, and we should grab it with both hands.
And of course, listening to, President Paul Kagame, they're saying that we're not asking for carbon credits so others can continue using coal, but we're really calling for drastic changes. And I suppose that's where the nub of some of the issues are going to have to be, because if there is going to have to be action, it has to be, as you say, across the world.
Yes, both in mitigation and adaptation, both sides of that coin, the reducing emissions and ramping up investment in adaptation. Africa really needs both of those things to happen, the mitigation internationally. So this is absolutely vital. And if we're to avoid losing GDP, as the president said in his speech so aptly, we are starting to lose GDP due to climate impacts. That is a loss and a damage effect. And let's rather invest in resilience, adaptation, and avoiding the loss of this GDP. We have time to do it, and we should really accelerate our efforts to do so, because it has so many other benefits as well.
And, when you listen to some of, the activists, they talk about how for them, South Africa, like other developing countries, need to make sure that when they move to decarbonize their economies, they should not leave communities and some of the workers at a disadvantage, particularly when it comes to some of their livelihoods. And one thinks of, some of the communities that would be impacted here. How then does the country then move to balance the scale here to ensure that the transition happens, but at the same time that no one is disadvantaged?
That is an absolutely vital component of what we have to do, and that is where this funding will come in and help us so much. Repurposing coal-fired power plants to become something new, and to re-energize communities around those power plants that have been suffering the health effects of that pollution. What an opportunity, and if you think of the number of jobs that we could start creating in South Africa, and if we position ourselves in Southern Africa to be a leader in this space, we could be exporting our expertise, our skills, our products for decades to come, and that would have benefits across the entire region. So this is not just a once-off idea. This is something that could be really integrated into regional development planning and make our region one of the world leaders in this space, because we can leapfrog over this really dirty development phase for the rest of Southern Africa.
I suppose then you listening to what you're saying, you don't share the concerns that some of the unions, when you listen to them, have, and say that it's not time to do this at a fast pace. You need to wait and really make sure that everything is in place. Workers are not going to lose their jobs. But I'm listening to you being very optimistic to say that there shouldn't be that kind of concern here and we shouldn't be waiting.
No, look, I think any transition like this has got to be carefully considered. And, while there is urgency, we don't want to rush into something that would leave us worse off. That's something we absolutely want to avoid. But this is where the Presidential Climate Commission has been doing some incredible work over the last few years to assess these options. And I'm sure more work will yet be done, and we will pilot a number of things. The sooner we start trying these things out and piloting them, the better. And we can learn as we go along. But I'm convinced that the ultimate outcome will be well worth it. And I do share the concerns of the unions. Of course, you hear those voices, and they are representing their people. And we've got to take that into account. You can't just ignore that. Of course not.
I suppose it's going to be a balancing act here, as you say. I wonder, Prof, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this one. There's been, of course, a lot of talk around, fossil fuels and the emissions and all of that. How difficult are the conversations right now, given the fact that there's, this impact that is being felt the world over of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and we're seeing some countries reverting back to fossil fuels. How difficult are the conversations behind closed doors, given this?
Well, I think there have been some interesting unintended consequences. For example, I think Europe has stockpiled a large amount of gas and they've had a fairly mild early winter. So, in a way, Russia blocking its gas supplies has done itself a great disservice. But the conversations are not easy, and these transitions are not going to happen at the blink of an eye. Fossil fuels are a very, very powerful energy source. There's a lot of energy in very high density. You think about putting a few tens of liters in a motor car and you can drive that thing 400, 500 kilometers. That is a very, very powerful energy source to replace. So let's not underestimate the challenges, but the costs of using this cheap and energy source are too high. We know they're too high. They're not being built into the world's economy, and we are now really starting to feel the pain of that impact. And we really don't have a choice. It's just a question of how fast we do it and how well we do it and how inclusively we do it. All those things have got to be met.
And Prof, I wonder, what is your assessment when you look at the situation back home? Because when we speak to some of the activists, some of them, I was speaking to them last night, they seem to not be convinced that South Africa is in a position where, the government has, is better prepared to be able to deal with the continuous impact of climate change that we've also seen in South Africa, because we've not been immune to this problem. We've seen droughts, we've seen floods. So I wonder, do you think that the government is presenting almost like a face of being well prepared going into the future?
There are very few governments around the world who are prepared for climate change impacts. We just got to look at what happened in Europe the last few months. The Rhine River drying up, what's happened in China, what's happened in North America. Climate change can really, these adverse impacts can really hammer an economy. And, the economic models that have been used up to now have been too simplistic to capture the multiple effects of what happens. So they have underestimated these things. So, I think in South Africa, we've done some pretty good work on preparing. And a lot of, our agricultural folks are reasonably well prepared. We've got an incredible water management system around the country. It's under a lot of stress, obviously, but if you think of our interbasin transfers between dams, that is a built-in adaptation system. So, we've got all the basics, not all of them, we've got a lot of the basics in place. And we should really build on that basis, and we can do so.
And I suppose building on it could potentially then maybe also add into the conversation, some debt restructuring or debt reforms to assist the countries that, have really dealt with the loss and the impact. I mean, you look at the damage that's also been caused, as you say.
Well, look, I don't think we should be taking on debt to do these things. I'm of the belief that as a country, we're in control of our own fiscal matters. We can invest our own money into things that will pay dividends for years to come. We don't have to borrow money to do this. We can show that we can invest our own money into these systems, and we show that we're building jobs. We're building a GDP and a strong, stable, and diversified economy that will pay dividends. And, I think we need to look at really taking control of our fiscal investments into climate resilience without having to rely on loans. Of course, we can use all the help we can get, but these sorts of investments will pay themselves back over years in terms of new jobs and new careers and a new future for our younger generation. So let's look at it holistically.
Yeah, definitely. Prof, thank you so much. Do appreciate your insights this evening. That is the Stellenbosch University's School for Climate Studies Acting Director, Professor Guy Midgley, talking to us about, of course, the developments around COP27. When we come back, Francis is in conversation with the Mfuleni municipality.